Start with talking about your background and how you became interested in schizophrenia, first of all, and kind of the direction.
Well, I'm a psychologist, and I have been at the University of Oregon since 1965. In 1979, I got interested in understanding the neural systems related to selective attention. I had studied selective attention in normal undergraduates primarily for a number of years. I got interested in the neural systems because there had been a lot of work in the alert monkey and suggesting what particular parts of the brain were active during attention in the sense of orienting to particular locations, visual field. And so I began to run patients with lesions in various locations, including parietal and frontal and midbrain, thalamic, and so on.
So you know the different separations affect the
To try to find out, yes, how different parts of the brain affect selective attention. And after a number of years of doing that, I got fairly close to a kind of general hypothesis of how brain systems are related to components of cognition in the attention system. And I had an opportunity to go to Washington University Medical School in St. Louis to work using a neuroimaging method that had been developed that allows you to look at the areas of the brain that are active in terms of blood flow with normal people. And I did quite a bit of that work there, mostly with spatial attention and language. And then as a result of that, I got involved with a group in psychiatry there. You know, schizophrenia is a psychiatric disorder for which the underlying brain systems are not known. And a friend of mine there, a psychiatrist there, a guy named Terry Early, had done some scanning of never medicated schizophrenics and found a very focal left-sided abnormality. It's actually in the left lobus pallidus. And I went to a meeting and heard some papers, and people said, well, you know, schizophrenia is a deficit of attention. That had been a common theory. And so I said, well, deficit of attention. I don't know how to measure that, so I decided I would measure it, so I did, and that's where the schizophrenia work came from. And it eventually made contact with the PET, with the scanning neural imaging data, and so we developed this paper and then a theory.
Now, I'm not quite clear. Is this attention deficit a cause or a symptom?
That's a good question. Our current result, and this is very, very tentative, makes it look like it is not a marker of the gene. As you know, schizophrenia runs in families. There is a genetic basis, but one doesn't know. It's not a simple gene.
Well, I've also heard talk of a virus.
You can ask, well, that's another theory. There is a genetic basis, though. There may be also viral aspects of it. And you can ask, if one monozygotic twin has schizophrenia, will the other? Or to what extent? Well, you can also ask that with respect to these marker type tasks. And we have been asking that, and it looks like it's disease specific, not gene specific. That doesn't mean it's a cause. It's certainly not a cause. I mean, but it may mean that it could mean that the disorder we're measuring is a result of some brain abnormality. It does not appear that it's the result of the medication, because we ran non-medicated people and showed it. But it does not appear to occur in the co-twins, non-schizophrenic co-twins, which means it's not linked to the gene or genes that are coding for schizophrenia. Is that clear enough?
Yeah, I think so. I'm also curious about, you mentioned the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. I'm not totally clear on exactly how the different functions are between those.
Well, no one's totally clear about the functions, but you do know the brain consists of two hemispheres that are held together by the corpus callosum. And they have these characteristics. The left side of the brain is responsible for orienting rightward, and the right side of the brain for orienting leftward. So if you move your eyes to the right, or if you just shift your attention to the right without moving your eyes, that's presumably done with the left side of the brain. And of course your right hand is controlled from the left side. primarily, especially for refined movements and vice versa. So we do know in the motor system that there's a lot of lateralized control, and attention system seems similar to that. Now there's some specializations. For as you know, language is often controlled by the left hemisphere, and right-handed people practically exclusively. So those are some of the things we know about, but there's probably lots of things we don't know about too.
Well, since you're saying that in right-handed people, it's the left side of the hemisphere that's language oriented, right?
That's pretty well
And
established.
since schizophrenia have a problem with their left side, is it kind of related directly to a language problem?
Yeah, well, they have they definitely have a problem in, if you just take the language produced by schizophrenic people, it is definitely abnormal on the average. And most people have thought of it as perhaps a disorder of thought, not of language. It's not necessarily that they have the right intention, but they can't get the words out.
They don't have the right intentions.
It's as the intention is, well, at least different than normal.
Yeah.
And yes, we think that that's probably a lateralized function and is showing some of the same. We have a kind of theory about that deficit arising in what we call the anterior attentional system, which is a part of the brain that involves midline structures. That is, midline in the sense that they're not on the lateral part of but in the center. Midline structures, which at least seem to include an area which we call the anterior cingulate gyrus. And we think that's the control of that over some of the thought processes is part of the abnormality.
Now, there's this lack of attention. So is the schizophrenic is having trouble concentrating on a certain one issue? I mean, they can't keep a train of thought.
Well, one of the things attention does for you in the semantic domain, we think, and a lot of this is pretty speculative, but there is quite a literature in normals on it, is suppose you take a word that has multiple meanings, like palm. Now, when you think about palm in a particular context, you attend to some representation that involves a particular meaning of the term. When you do that, the other meanings are generally not available to your awareness. And sometimes they are, a pun, for example, or sometimes. But in general, they're not. Most of the English words are ambiguous, but you don't have any problem. Now, one of the ways we think that attention is abnormal in schizophrenics is that their inability to concentrate on a particular keeps active multiple meanings, and therefore it makes it very difficult to follow out your intention, which is to have a discussion. You can see I'm picking words that fit my intention, which is to explain to you. And I'm not saying, oh gee, the moon is coming out over the trees or whatever. I'm not going off on tangents, hopefully. And that's the hallmark of normal thought processes. And of course it's difficult for all of us. I mean, we don't always succeed and so on. So a person can have mild problems along these lines and he's not schizophrenic. So it's not something that, but if the problem is gross, so that when I come across a particular word, then I might take another meaning of that word completely and then shift the conversation and develop that and then shift to something else. That describes quite a bit of one characteristic of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. That is, the symptoms that the patient usually presents with in late adolescence. You know, it's a disorder that usually manifests itself in late adolescence. And usually as the disease progresses, those florid positive symptoms, which include hallucinations and lots of other things, which we try to describe in our theoretical papers, are reduced, and the residue generally becomes what are often called the negative symptoms, withdrawal, and, quiescence, withdrawal, and so on. So we think that describes some of the positive symptoms.
So these positive symptoms are like related to the overstimulation that does a schizophrenic.
Well, I think that's a result. The attention system prevents overstimulation by allowing you to concentrate on a limited corpus. And of course, if you don't have that system work, then you're going to get overstimulated. But my guess is that that's a result of but that's a guess. I don't know, but that's the way I would think about it. That as a result, there are multiple activations going on that make it difficult for the schizophrenic to stay along a common line.
Could then the negative symptoms come as like your brain tries to adapt to the attention?
Possibly, and also a lot of the negative symptoms of withdrawal probably come from the punishing personal experiences that arise out of the syndrome. People begin to treat you in a particular way.
So the thoughts are, since they don't have attention, it's more chaotic.
Well, that's a little extreme. I'm not saying they don't have.
I've heard some theories. I'm not sure if like schizophrenia comes from order trying to understand chaos or something like that. It's like
well, there's lots of schizophrenic theories. I mean, this is very, and you know, you can describe these things at many levels and with many languages and so on. And you know, some of these theories are in conflict, but some of them are probably just orthogonal. I mean, of course, if there are multiple activations, it's very chaotic. Now, would you want to say, well, it's chaos, or is the primary hallmark? Well, in some ways, but there seem to be that might be thought of as a result of the activation.
I'm not sure. Is one side of the brain more emotional and the other more logical? Is that a mistake?
Well, probably not. That's probably not true. You know, language is so closely associated with what we mean by logic in most of our normal discussions of logic that, of course, insofar as language is left-sided, then there would be that tie to logic. But that's not at all. It's not clear that, you know, you couldn't have logics in other domains. And the brain of normal people work together. You know, it's not as if the left did it something. The left influences the right side of the body and the right the left side of the body. There's that, but of course most cognitive tasks are developing components which are not strictly lateral lines.
I'm just curious how centralized you've got schizophrenia is right now. How centralized the studies are. Is it like just one? Is it pretty much decided that it's one disorder, or is it like several? Or
well, the dominant view is that there are many disorders and that there's great heterogeneity. One of the surprises of our study, and it's really a fairly minor, a fairly small study, is that there seemed to be much more uniformity than we thought there was going to be. Now, I'm not sure why that was, whether that's true or whether it was just fortuitous or what, but I would say the most dominant view is that there are multiple disorders and so on. What we think is that if you have these marker tests, you can and if there are multiple disorders, then you can understand the underlying physiology of the marker of the tasks of what neural systems that perform these tasks that are disordered, and then that would be a good way to group schizophrenia patients into schizophrenic categories. That is, you might find common underlying physiological abnormality in different groups. And there may be several groups. One of the problems is there hasn't been any way to identify these groups because there's so many multi-dimensions on which things are varying. So that might turn out to be a useful aspect of our work, even if it turns out that there are multiple etiologies, multiple disorders, and so on.
I'd like to talk about some of the causes that I've heard of. You talk about the genetic part, and I mentioned the slow virus. There are brain structure abnormalities and schizophrenia. I mean, like you talked about
there are lots of reported. The most commonly reported, but not necessarily the truest abnormality of this type, is a frontal reduction in blood flow and metabolism in the front compared to the back.
So the schizophrenic uses more of their hind parts of their brain than the...
Well, I think the basic idea is that the frontal lobes are disordered in some way, less active in some way. Now that disorder, that frontal hypofrontality idea, has, I think, is primarily due to medication. That is, those patients had a lot of medication. It looks now as if you run never medicated schizophrenics, you don't necessarily get that hypofrontality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in one study, one of the psychiatrists I work with found this rather focal left basal ganglia deficit in his never medicated. And that sort of fits with the most popular physiological view about schizophrenia, namely that it's a problem with the neurotransmitter dopamine. And that would fit with the basal ganglia, because that's a dopaminergic area and so on. And where we've thought about it, and there are many theories, and this is just one way of thinking about it. Where we have thought about it is that one of the dopamine systems, the ventral tegmental area, which is the origin of one of the dopamine systems, which in fact innervates the mid-frontal areas, which have the anterior attention system, is the focus of the abnormality. So that the lack of dopamine in this mid-frontal area disorders this frontal attentional system, and that the other symptoms follow from that. That's the focus of our theory. And, that may be right, or it may not, or it may be describe one part of schizophrenia and not others, and so on.
I read an article about creativity. They did PET scans or some kind of scan of the brain.
Higher.
I'm not sure what kind of, but they said that more creative people, when they're highly creative, actually had less blood flow or something in the frontal lobes, like you're talking about. So could there be like some link between schizophrenia?
I haven't seen that.
Oh, you haven't.
That is not generally true. Well, when you say more creative people, when they're thinking about, you've got to tell me exactly what task.
Well,
so on. You see what might, a simple artifact of this time might be that for the more creative tasks, the task might be simpler. So when you compare the more if you take a baseline and then you have them both thinking about this task, let's say, suppose it's simpler for the more creative person. Well, now you find less blood flow in that. So there's enough pitfalls in this kind of research that I just don't know that study, and without knowing it, I really can't say too much.
The idea I was getting there is that a lot of times they attribute creativity to being able to come up with original combinations of different ideas. And schizophrenics, they do come up with bizarre combinations.
Yeah, but it's not so frequent that those bizarre combinations are ones that society then points out as for unusual accomplishment.
Yeah, okay.
You see, creativity really is true that one of the things of creativity is bizarre associations, and you get people with bizarre associations. But the other element of creativity is a kind of societal one, almost a sociological element. It's something that is not just bizarre, but
everybody accepts.
But at least some people accept, and so you're seen as having conducted great symphonies or composed great symphonies, something like that. And as far as I know, there's no disciplined study showing a connection between schizophrenia and great accomplishment like this. Actually, most schizophrenics whose intelligence may be high, some may have high intelligence, don't really live up to what you would have expected a person of that ability to do.
That kind of goes against the common kind of misbelief that the mad scientist or the mad genius who's like, I understand. Is it possible for genius and schizophrenia to interact in some way?
Well, I don't know. You could imagine if, suppose both schizophrenia and genius had simple genetic basis, and you could imagine, say, they might be on the same chromosome. It's unlikely that genius is a simple Mendelian characteristic, or that schizophrenia, in fact, we almost know for sure schizophrenia isn't. So, but you could imagine that there could be a link at the genetic level, but as far as I know, there's no real evidence. It's just a thought.
The reason I was asking is that I read some stuff about they were dissecting schizophrenic brains, and they found like twice as many dopamine receptors or something like that.
Well, but that's not. That's true.
I also heard something about Einstein. They dissected his brain and found out it was like twice as dense, in certain areas.
Well, let's take it one at a time.
Okay.
If there's a deficit of dopamine, for example, as there is in Parkinson's patients, you can get an adaptation which increases the number of receptors. Mm-hmm. It is not a sign that you're a super strong person or something. Yeah. It's an adaptation that's to the deficit of the transmitter substance. So the idea that they found, even if they did find, I don't know that study, but even if they did find a lot of dopamine receptors, and there have been some things like this. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're super people or anything. It just means that there's an adaptation to it. Could mean their adaptation to a dopamine deficit. Now, as far as Einstein's brain, my recollection was that it was pretty normal, but I could be wrong. I know they did do a dissection, and I'm sure it's in some article someplace, but I don't. My guess is you're not going to be able to find brain weight or something like that as a very clear sign of genius or anything. You going downstairs?
Yeah.
I'm almost done, so I'll be going down in a few minutes.
Yeah, just gonna check my bag.
I'll just come by you, get you.
Now I'm curious how those drugs that reduce the dopamine level, how do they actually remit the symptoms?
Well, we don't really know.
Because I was just curious, because that means that if you give them that dopamine-reducing drug, they become able to concentrate better?
The general effect of antipsychotics is to produce a reduction in the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, the florid hallucinations,
The overstimulation.
the formal thought disorder, and so, exactly how they work is not certainly isn't known by me, and is not known. I can't remember exactly what was the occasion of your talking to me like this. Was it because you wanted me to tell you a bit about schizophrenia?
The schizophrenia and what you've been doing.
Oh, okay, right.
That's
Because I just wanted to point out to you that although I have this paper on schizophrenia and a couple of other theoretical papers with Dr. Early, it's not been my primary. So
That's okay.
I might be a little weak on some things. There is a lot written about it, and I don't want to pretend to you that what we've written is necessarily the final story or the right story or something like that, because it's just there are just lots of ideas about it, and there may be multiple ideas. I do think it's an interesting set of results in it, and people thought it was interesting, but it's a long way from a clearly established theoretical view.
Yeah. So I'd like to close off by asking you a little bit about the delusions of schizophrenics, if you know anything. Are there any common factors that they have?
Well, they're most heavily auditory. That's one common factor. It is often believed by a number of people with some evidence that they are voices that the person himself is producing. And to think about this, have you thought to yourself in language?
Your own internal way?
Yeah. Is that a way you think to yourself sometimes?
So, yeah.
And possibly even under some conditions you might find yourself talking to yourself.
Yeah.
And that's a fairly rare thing in most people's lives, but they certainly talk to themselves internally. And the question is, how do you know that it's you? Well, it's possible that it is a function of some particular brain structure to make sure that self-induced movements, including self-induced thoughts, are clearly labeled as belonging to you and not to someone else. Because after all, when you think to yourself in words, you're clearly stimulating some of the parts of the brain, not all of them, but some of the parts of the brain that you stimulate when you hear me. Now, a common theory is that aspect, which is perhaps part of the attention system, that aspect which labels something as your own, is gone and is disordered in the schizophrenic. So the hallucinations may not be all that different than normal in quality. It's just that they may have lost the identification as something that's being said by oneself. And when one set of experiments by Bick and Kinsborn was to try to put the person in a competing situation where he was unable to generate voices, and they did get a reduction in auditory hallucination. There are, of course, hallucinations in other modalities that are reported, but auditory ones are way out.
I'm a little curious about the religious aspect sometimes of they're having religious delusions like they're Jesus or something like that, or like Zeus. I don't know if you've seen him.
No, I know the phenomena, and a good share of our schizophrenics did have religious sounding delusions. It's one of those things that is real hard for me to know.
Okay.
It may be just the important part religion plays
social
in
kinda.
in the thoughts of many people that are suppressed
Yeah.
in social situations. Now, if you're if you're a person for whom all that is released, but it may be more than that.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the problem in any of these psychoses or even in neurological disorders. If you take the medical literature as a whole, you get reports of many, many interesting phenomena that are associated, many more than we've mentioned in schizophrenia. And if you're going to try to get a scientific handle on the disorder, then you expect that it will not be coextensive with all the different, you won't be able to explain everything. There probably is a core, maybe it isn't the core that we see, maybe it's some other core, but there probably is a core, and probably any good theory will focus on that core. It could be a great theory and turn out to predict lots of things and turn out to be the best theory and still never handle some of the problems and so on because it just isn't able to do so.
I'm curious if you've heard anything about the use of existentialism as a treatment.
Existential philosophy or
Yeah,
existential
I've heard
psychology.
of this psychologist named R.D. Laing or something
Oh,
like that.
Lang, yeah.
Bizarre.
I have never, I'm not a clinical psychologist.
Yeah.
I've actually never treated schizophrenia, or anyone else really. But the psychiatrist I work with, the group I work with are so-called biological psychiatrists, and so they just follow drug therapies and a little bit of quieting down and so on, but basically just drug therapy. So I know R.D. Lang's book and so on a little bit, but I really don't know much about it.
One last question. I'm curious if studying schizophrenia is actually helpful in studying consciousness itself. It's kind of like an altered state.
Well, that's my goal. I mean, my field is the study of attention. And attention includes awareness, includes sustaining alertness over time, that is being able to, which is necessary for awareness, but also what particular things you're aware of.
The stuff that actually makes you alive.
That's my area of research, and I've worked a lot on that. And in recent years, as a result of this kind of physiological work that I've been involved in, I have tried to deal with disorders of attention in the hopes that they would illuminate different aspects of it. Now, for me, not for anyone who talks to me, the interest in schizophrenia is not the likelihood that I'll cure anyone with it, because I don't think I have that likelihood, but that I will understand from the nature of the disorder something more about the anterior attention system and its relationship to the semantic system. So that's my interest.
Consciousness from a different perspective.
That's right, yeah. And because we've done lots of studies in normals, for example, we know in you, normal person, if an ambiguous word is presented to you, you may only be aware of one meaning, but we know that your nervous system elaborates multiple meanings. And that although you're only aware of one, we can show experimentally that there's other meanings activated. And so you can see how that theory in the normal ties in to the deficit in the schizophrenic. So now maybe I'm being misled. Maybe some of the things I knew about normals has guided what I've come to think about schizophrenics. But the way I think about it is that the way we've been able to describe the schizophrenic syndrome feeds back and helps us get more confidence in our general theory of normal. So that's my area of interest, yes.
Thanks a lot.
Yep, you're welcome.